When the Allies began tracking down the high-ranking officers of the Third Reich, they often only found their wives. The men had died, fled, or committed suicide. The women, on the other hand, were still there, detained, interrogated, or simply ignored. The dilemma soon arose: were they active accomplices or figureheads trapped by context? All claimed to have been merely mothers, wives, or passive witnesses, but many had embraced Nazi ideology before their own husbands. Some participated in propaganda, others directly benefited from plunder and repression. Several survived decades rewriting their past and keeping the regime's legacy alive. What happened to them after the defeat? Why did so many escape justice, and how was the myth of their apparent innocence constructed while they lived in the very center of horror? Magda Goebbels, the mother of the Reich. Dr. Kerta Heusemann, the dentist who identified the bodies in the bunker, could never forget the scene. 6 children neatly lined up in their beds as if asleep. Helga had bruises on her face. The youngest, Haida, was still holding her favorite doll. Between April 30th and May 1st, 1945, Magda Goebbels had committed the most disturbing crime of the collapse of the Third Reich: the systematic murder of her own children to prevent them from living in a world without Hitler. The preparation was meticulous. Magda spent the last few hours playing with her children, reading them stories, singing lullabies. She told them they would be taking a medicine to help them sleep better in the noisy bunker. One by one, she led them to their rooms. First the morphine, administered by SS dentist Helmut Kunz. Then Magda personally placed the cyanide capsules between their teeth and crushed them. Helga, the eldest, woke up and struggled. Her mother had to hold her tightly until the poison took effect. Far from being an act of maternal desperation, this crime represented the logical culmination of a life dedicated to political fanaticism. Magda had embraced the National Socialist movement before her own husband. When she met Joseph Goebbels in 1929, she had already spent years searching for a cause that would give transcendent meaning to her existence. But the truly decisive moment came when Hitler personally chose her as a symbol of Aryan motherhood. From then on, her private life was transformed into a political performance. Her marriage to Goebbels was essentially a doctrinal contract. Hitler served as a witness, transforming the ceremony into a public declaration on the demographic future of the Reich. The 6 children that followed were conceived as political products. Each pregnancy was celebrated by propaganda, each birth became national news, and each family photograph was distributed as educational material on the ideal Aryan family. During the war, while Joseph orchestrated the propaganda of extermination, Magda specialized in the iconography of female resistance. Her public appearances in military hospitals, arms factories, and patriotic ceremonies established her as the embodiment of German maternal sacrifice. Millions of German women looked to her as a model of dignity in times of crisis. Her image decorated train stations, government offices, and community centers throughout the territory controlled by the regime. Joseph's constant infidelities, especially his public affair with the Czech actress Lida Barova, placed Magda in humiliating situations that she endured for purely political reasons. When, in 1938, scandal threatened to damage the movement's image, it was Hitler who personally intervened to preserve the marriage. The Führer understood that the Goebbels family was too valuable a propaganda institution to allow adultery to destroy it. The decision to move the family into the bunker in April 1945 marked the beginning of the final phase of Magda's plan. She had concluded that if National Socialism could not survive, neither should her children. In letters written during those days, she explained her logic. A world dominated by Bolsheviks and Jews would be too cruel for children raised in racial purity. She preferred to kill them herself rather than hand them over to enemies of the Reich. After poisoning her children, Magda went up to the Chancellery garden with Joseph. She had spent the last few hours getting ready: perfect makeup, an elegant dress, and carefully selected jewelry. She wanted to die as she had lived for 15 years, representing the feminine ideal of the Hitler regime. Joseph shot himself in the head. She bit into a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were doused with gasoline and incinerated according to prior instructions. The Soviet soldiers who found the remains the next day were particularly shocked by the scene of the children. Veterans hardened by years of combat emerged from the bunker visibly shaken. The contrast between the apparent domesticity of the children's rooms and the reality of the mass murder revealed the utterly inhuman nature of the doctrine Magda had served until the end. Eva Braun, Hitler's secret lover. In the home movies Eva Braun made during the war years, she appears laughing while skiing in the Bavarian Alps, celebrating at the Berghof, and playing with her dogs. These films, shot while the German armies devastated Europe and the extermination camps were operating, show a woman who had transformed frivolity into an art form. Her willful ignorance of the horror surrounding her was not a product of naivety, but a conscious project of psychological self-preservation. Eva had perfected the technique of not knowing. During 16 years as Hitler's companion, she developed sophisticated mechanisms to avoid confronting the implications of her privileged position. She didn't read political newspapers, didn't attend official meetings, or ask questions about Hitler's work. Her world was deliberately limited to aesthetic concerns: fashion, photography, sports, entertainment. This compartmentalization was not accidental, but methodical. Her 2 suicide attempts in 1932 and 1935 revealed a structurally dependent personality that had learned to use the threat of self-destruction as a tool of power. Eva understood that in a deeply unequal relationship with the most powerful man in Europe, extreme vulnerability was her only form of influence. Each suicidal crisis resulted in increased attention from Hitler, improved living conditions, and deeper integration into her private routine. The construction of her public invisibility was a collaborative project between Eva and the Third Reich's propaganda apparatus. Hitler had carefully crafted his image as a man wedded solely to Germany who had renounced personal happiness for the good of the nation. Eva became the regime's best-kept secret, present at every private meeting of the inner circle, but completely absent from the public narrative about the Führer. This double existence provided her with extraordinary benefits without any visible responsibilities. She had access to almost unlimited resources: wardrobes designed by the best European seamstresses, jewelry confiscated in occupied territories, luxury cars and residences in the most exclusive locations in the Reich. Her lifestyle was sustained entirely by systematic plunder organized by the government apparatus, but Eva never showed any curiosity about the source of her well-being. Eva's wartime photo albums and diaries document an existence of surreal luxury that coexisted without apparent tension with industrial genocide. Her recorded concerns include problems with maids, disputes over room decor, complaints about the weather, and gossip within the party's social circle. This absorption in trivialities while millions were dying in extermination camps reveals a capacity for dissociation that goes beyond simple frivolity. Her relationship with the wives of other hierarchs functioned as a system of mutual reinforcement of willful ignorance. Social gatherings at the Berghof focused on consciously superficial topics: fashion, interior design, childcare, entertainment. It was a hermetically sealed feminine universe that excluded any contamination with the political reality of the movement. This solidarity in triviality provided mutual legitimacy to avoid confronting moral responsibilities. Eva's decision to travel to Berlin in April 1945 to meet with Hitler in the bunker was the most revealing act of her character. While other members of the inner circle sought loopholes or negotiated surrenders, Eva deliberately chose to share Hitler's fate. She did so not out of political heroism, but because she could not conceive of an existence separate from the only life she had known for 16 years. The civil marriage celebrated on April 29th in the bunker culminated a relationship that had always been more symbolic than romantic. Eva finally obtained the official recognition she had sought, but only for 24 hours. The ceremony, witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann, was an act of retroactive legitimization that transformed years of secret concubinage into an official marriage. Her death on April 30th, biting into a cyanide capsule as Hitler shot himself, was consistent with a life dedicated to avoiding the consequences of her choices. Eva left no testimonies, reflections, or confessions about her role in the regime. Her final silence was the logical extension of the silence she had cultivated throughout her relationship with Hitler, the absolute refusal to acknowledge, question, or take responsibility for her complicity. Gerda Bormann, the Reich fanatic. Gerda Bormann breathed her last on March 23, 1946, in an Italian prisoner of war hospital consumed by ovarian cancer but maintaining a staunch loyalty to National Socialism until the very end. In her final weeks, she interpreted her illness as a sacred sacrifice for the purity of her ideals. Her final letters to her children contained not a word of regret. She advised them to honor their father's memory, keep the movement's flame alive, and prepare for the future restoration of the Reich. Her radicalization had begun in childhood. Raised by Walter Buch, one of the party's earliest followers and later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Gerda developed a Manichaean worldview from adolescence: superior Aryans versus subhumans destined for extermination. When she fell in love with Martin Bormann in 1928, she chose a doctrinaire companion who would amplify her most extreme convictions. Their marriage functioned as a political cell within the movement's apparatus. The correspondence between Gerda and Martin, preserved in historical archives, reveals a disturbing programmatic intimacy. Gerda not only supported her husband's decisions, but also pushed them toward more radical positions. In letters from 1942 and 1943, she expressed explicit satisfaction with the elimination of European Jews, enthusiasm for the violent colonization of Eastern Europe, and absolute contempt for peoples considered racially inferior. Her anti-Semitism surpassed even that of many male party leaders. With 10 children, she had transformed her home into a living demonstration of the Reich's demographic policy. Each pregnancy was celebrated as a racial victory, each child raised as a future leader of the millennia-old empire. Gerda was active in the League of German Women, organized meetings with the wives of other leaders, and served as a model of the National Socialist maternal ideal. Her influence extended through female networks that penetrated the entire party apparatus. During her years in power, she operated as a key but invisible figure in the regime's structure. Her social gatherings functioned as political coordination centers where decisions were made on party personnel, propaganda campaigns were planned, and resistance against rival factions was organized. Her salon became one of the most important centers of power in the Reich, rivaling the male official offices in influence. Her April 1945 escape demonstrated her calculating coolness and realistic understanding of the consequences she would face if captured. She disguised 4 children as orphans, posed as an orphanage director, falsified documents, and executed a complex plan as the Reich collapsed. Her ability to maintain composure and leadership in extreme crises manifested a determination that transcended the maternal instinct of protection. The refuge in South Tyrol was not a desperate hiding place, but an operational base. He had hidden compromising party documents, maintained contact with other fugitives from the movement, and hoped to reactivate organizational networks once the political situation stabilized. His arrest by British agents thwarted plans for underground resistance, but it did not shake his conviction that the cause would eventually triumph over its temporary enemies. The discovery of her advanced cancer provided Gerda with a final opportunity to demonstrate unwavering fanaticism. She refused treatments that would have prolonged her life because she interpreted suffering as a spiritual purification that prepared her to reunite with fallen comrades. Her deathbed conversion to Catholicism represented not repentance, but a search for a religious framework that would legitimize her hatred of enemies of the Reich. The notes she wrote to her children from the hospital show a woman facing death without acknowledging the criminal nature of the system she had served. She justified the war as a necessary racial crusade, defended Martin as a misunderstood hero, and praised Hitler as a genius betrayed by adverse historical circumstances. In one particularly poignant letter she wrote, "Even if we die, our sacrifice will have been for an eternal Germany." Her death brought to a close the life of one of the most dangerous women in the Third Reich. Her danger lay not in having wielded weapons, but in having embodied and transmitted the movement's most toxic values with a conviction that knew no bounds. She was a propagandist, organizer, and fanatic whose influence extended far beyond her family circle to penetrate the fundamental structures of the political apparatus. Lena Heydrich, the Great Widow of the Holocaust. In 1976, Lena Heydrich published Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal, a book that achieved the impossible, presenting Reinhard Heydrich, architect of the Holocaust, as a victim of historical misunderstandings. For 34 years after her husband's assassination, Lena had systematically constructed an alternative narrative that transformed the organizer of the final solution into an honorable officer destroyed by forces beyond his control. Her rehabilitation campaign achieved partial but significant success. Heydrich's assassination by Czech resistance fighters in June 1942 transformed Lena into a politically valuable widow. Hitler and Himmler showered her with honors, decorations, and a lifetime pension, placing her among the richest women in the Reich. Her grief was exploited by the regime's propaganda, which presented her as a symbol of German motherhood mourning fallen heroes. Lena embraced this role with an intensity that manifested both personal ambition and profound programmatic conviction. Heydrich's funeral ceremony, held with full state honors, also served as a public platform to consolidate Lena's official image. In the cortege, surrounded by high-ranking officers, her figure was used as a living emblem of national sacrifice. In the following months, her image appeared in newspapers, newsreels, and propaganda posters as an example of feminine nobility in the face of patriotic loss. Her administration of the Jungfernbrechen estate during the final years of the war demonstrated organizational skills and a ruthless nature. She supervised the labor of hundreds of enslaved prisoners, corresponded with SS officers to coordinate labor supplies, and managed an agricultural operation dependent on the concentration camp system. Far from being a wife immune to crimes, she was an active and conscious beneficiary of the apparatus her husband had created. Post-war archives reveal that Lena directly intervened in requests for the reassignment of forced laborers, citing inefficiency or inappropriate behavior. On at least 3 occasions, she signed reports that led to disciplinary transfers, some of which resulted in harsher camps. These decisions were not incidental. They reflected a full understanding of the repressive structure of the labor system she administered. Her transformation into a nostalgia tourism entrepreneur revealed an intuitive understanding of the psychology of selective memory. The boarding house she ran on Fehmarn became a place of pilgrimage for SS veterans, Reich nostalgics, and sympathizers of historical revisionism. Lena offered more than accommodation, a sanitized version of the past that eliminated disturbing aspects and emphasized elements of honor, sacrifice, and patriotism. Visitors found not only rooms decorated with period portraits, but also carefully selected souvenirs, postcards with pictures of Heydrich, signed copies of Lena's book, and menus named after former National Socialist symbols. It was a business model that combined rural tourism with selective memory marketing, exploiting a niche that completely avoided illegality but bordered on the margins of what was acceptable. The denazification process became an unexpected opportunity for Lena. Her skill in navigating the post-war legal system, presenting herself as the innocent widow of a heroic husband, allowed her to avoid severe punishment and obtain significant financial benefits. The pension she received from the West German government for Heydrich's death on active duty was a legal victory that set dangerous precedents for similar cases. The books she published between 1952 and 1976 constituted a literary corpus devoted entirely to the rehabilitation of her husband and, by extension, the political system they had served. Presented as family memoirs and historical documentation, they functioned as disguised propaganda. Her talent for maintaining a personal and intimate tone while promoting extremist interpretations made them particularly persuasive to readers who would have rejected more explicit propaganda. These books were carefully edited to suggest an apolitical tone. They included domestic anecdotes, descriptions of the family environment, and childhood memories of his children. But between the lines, each episode was laden with ideological implications, intended to humanize Reinhard and redefine his legacy as an efficient technician rather than a historical criminal. Sales were modest but sustained in specific circles, ensuring their lasting impact. Her second marriage to Finnish theatre director Mauno Manninen in 1965 was a maneuver to change her surname and create a less compromised public identity. When Manninen died in 1969, Lena reverted to the surname Heydrich, demonstrating that pride in her first marriage outweighed practical considerations of convenience. The name Heydrich was her trademark in nostalgic circles. The lectures he gave for decades in neo-Nazi circles lent legitimacy to extremist interpretations of the history of the Third Reich. His talks, presented as objective testimony from someone who had been there, found receptive audiences who preferred his watered-down versions to the conclusions of academic historiography. His longevity gave him special authority as a survivor of the inner circle of power. These presentations often took place in private homes or reserved rooms, with limited access by invitation. In them, Lena interspersed Heydrich's recollections with personal observations on the state of the modern world, using her story to convey the idea that the Nazi past had been misunderstood rather than condemned. Recordings and transcripts of these sessions circulated on underground networks well into the 1980s. The life sentence handed down in absentia by Czechoslovak courts was never carried out, allowing Lena to operate freely in West Germany, where she enjoyed legal protection. This practical impunity gave her a platform from which to influence historical debates for generations. Her case highlighted fundamental limitations of the transitional justice process in post-war Europe. Lena's final years were marked by intense activity as a speaker and correspondent with researchers seeking primary sources on the Reich. Her testimony was cited in extremist literature for decades as evidence of the movement's supposedly honorable nature. She had demonstrated that a determined widow could influence historical understanding much more effectively than professional historians. Even at the end of her life, Lena maintained contact with alternative publishing circles in Germany, Austria, and Scandinavia. She oversaw translations of her books, approved reprints, and corrected passages she considered unsuitable for new generations of readers. This meticulous surveillance of her legacy demonstrates that her project was not merely conjugal or ideological, but strategic. Lena understood history as a contested terrain, and she chose to actively participate in its construction. Her death in 1985 closed an important chapter in post-war revisionism. For 4 decades, she had managed to keep alive a mythologized version of her husband and the apparatus he had served. Her success in avoiding legal consequences, obtaining benefits from the German state, and creating an alternative narrative of the past demonstrated that the war for memory could be as decisive as military conflicts. Margareta Himmler, the executioner's wife. The denazification tribunal that tried Margareta Himmler between 1948 and 1953 set fundamental precedents for female responsibility in genocidal regimes. For 5 years, German judges debated whether a woman married to the architect of the Holocaust could be held guilty of crimes she had witnessed, benefited from, but not directly committed. The final verdict highlighted both the limitations of the judicial system and Margaret's skill in exploiting gender expectations. The most damning evidence against Margaret came from her own diary. In March 1940, after visiting occupied Poland, she had written, "This Jewish and Polish mob, most of them don't look like human beings. The filth is indescribable." These words, scribbled casually, revealed a racial worldview that went far beyond casual anti-Semitism. They showed someone who had fully internalized the doctrine that justified systematic extermination. Her travels to occupied territories as a Red Cross official had exposed her directly to the regime's implementation of racial policies. Margaret had observed ghettos, labor camps, and deportation operations, documenting her impressions with bureaucratic detail that reflected approval rather than horror. Her official reports described these activities as necessary to create order in regions considered chaotic due to the presence of underpopulations. Heinrich's public infidelity with his secretary Hedwig Potthast in 1941 had placed Margarete in a humiliating position, which she handled with political calculation. Rather than seeking a divorce, she maintained the appearance of a stable marriage required by the government apparatus. This decision did not reflect victimhood, but rather an understanding that her status depended on maintaining her position as the official wife of the Reichsführer SS, even tolerating personal degradation. Managing the family estate during the war years transformed her into a direct participant in the system of plunder. Margareta oversaw the use of prisoners as domestic staff, managed properties confiscated from victims, and corresponded with officials regarding the distribution of expropriated assets. Her role as housewife included activities that made her complicit in the criminal apparatus that sustained the lifestyle of the political elite. Administrative documents preserved in state archives show that Margaret signed authorizations for repairs to confiscated properties in Prague, organized inventories of valuables received from Vienna, and approved logistical expenses for renovations in villas that had belonged to deported Jewish families. These actions not only confirm her knowledge of the appropriation processes, but also her direct participation in their administration. Her defense method was simple but effective. She presented herself as a traditional wife, deliberately kept aloof from her husband's professional activities. She claimed ignorance about concentration camps, denied knowledge of extermination policies, and attributed racist remarks to outside influences. Her lawyers argued that punishing a wife for her husband's crimes violated principles of individual responsibility. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving that Margaret had been more than a passive wife. They presented evidence of trips to occupied territories, documented derogatory comments, involvement in the management of stolen property, and correspondence with political officials. But the absence of documents directly linking her to specific political decisions weakened the prosecution's case. The tribunal also had to deal with difficulties inherent to its legal framework. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, the denazification tribunals lacked full criminal jurisdiction and operated under administrative criteria with broad interpretive margins. The 5 categories of culpability, from greatest to least responsibility, allowed for sentences ranging from full civil execution to simple warnings. In this environment, trials became arenas where personal appearance and social perception carried disproportionate weight compared to documentary evidence. The gender expectations of the time decisively influenced the process. Many judges assumed that women of Margaret's generation had been naturally excluded from important political decisions, limiting their responsibilities to traditional domestic spheres. This perspective ignored evidence that leaders' wives had operated as active participants in informal but effective power networks. During the hearings, Margaret appeared dressed in dark, discreet suits, without jewelry or symbols of the past. She presented herself as a silent widow, a self-sacrificing mother, a collateral victim of the collapse of a state. She never interrupted, never reacted emotionally. Her demeanor reinforced the mental framework that many jurists carried with them, that of a subordinate woman, not an enforcer. That image was as powerful as any legal argument presented. The 1953 verdict classified Margaret as a beneficiary of National Socialism, with a sentence of 30 days of penal labor, loss of civil rights, and the elimination of pension benefits. It was a symbolic sentence that recognized complicity without imposing severe punishments. The court implicitly accepted that female responsibility in the movement was qualitatively different from male responsibility. This precedent influenced the treatment of other wives of war criminals for decades to come. It established a pattern where female participation in genocidal structures was systematically minimized if it was exercised through traditional domestic roles. The decision reflected fundamental limitations in judicial understanding of the ways in which women could be complicit in state crimes. In later years, scholars and officials reviewed the case files as a key reference for assessing liability by association. Margaret's case was cited in internal discussions about future legal measures, not only in West Germany but also in Austria and Belgium, where similar proceedings were attempting to delineate what kind of connection to power could be considered criminal. Her trial became a silent template for an unnamed legal category, that of the powerful woman who operated without a signature, but not without will. Margaret's remaining years were spent in deliberate anonymity, which served as a final protective tactic. She adopted a maiden name, moved in with her sister, and avoided any public contact that might rekindle interest in her case. Her silence did not represent repentance, but rather a way of preserving the secrets she still possessed about the inner workings of the criminal apparatus. Her death in 1967 brought to a close a case that had defined legal parameters for assessing female responsibility for genocide. The precedent set by her trial continued to influence similar proceedings for generations, demonstrating that decisions made in denazification tribunals had consequences that extended far beyond individual cases to the general understanding of culpability in totalitarian regimes. Emmy Goering, the diva of the ruined regime. When Emmy Goering was released from prison in 1947, she had lost much more than material wealth. She had lost her identity as First Lady of the Third Reich. For the next 26 years, until her death in 1973, She transformed this social decline into a prolonged performance of declining imperial dignity. With the theatrical skills she had developed over decades of stage work, Emmy constructed a public persona that projected nostalgia without explicit apologetics, elegance without ostentation, and selective memory without outright denial of historical realities. The one-room apartment in Munich where she lived her final years contrasted dramatically with the palatial residences she had occupied during the Reich. However, Emmy decorated it carefully to maintain an appearance of refinement. Photographs from her theatrical glory days, a few pieces of furniture salvaged from Allied plunder, and fresh flowers replaced weekly. Every detail was calculated to convey the message that external circumstances had not altered her aristocratic essence. This modest but carefully orchestrated lifestyle was also a strategy of image control. Emmy understood that her symbolic survival depended not only on partial oblivion but also on the continuous refinement of her persona. She received select visitors, maintained written correspondence with admirers of old German theatre, and completely avoided any involvement in political circles. Her calculated neutrality was part of the legacy she wished to leave. Her occasional public appearances became minor but significant media events. Emmy had developed a specific interview technique. She answered questions about her past with elegantly vague answers that didn't compromise her political position, but didn't completely satisfy her interlocutors either. Phrases like, "We were patriots in difficult times," or "art transcends politics," allowed her to navigate dangerous conversations without admitting guilt or expressing regret. The publication of her autobiography, Under Seite meines Manners, in 1967, represented the most daring moment of her rehabilitation campaign. The book presented Hermann Göring as a war hero corrupted by political influences beyond his control, and herself as an apolitical artist trapped in extraordinary historical circumstances. This romanticized narrative conveniently eliminated her active participation in governmental events and her conscious enjoyment of power. Although the book was met with skepticism from critical circles, it also sparked interest in publishing circles, which marketed it as a female testimony to the collapse of the Third Reich. Emmy oversaw every detail of its publication: selection of photographs, cover design, and controlled distribution. She avoided flashy public launches, opting for discreet presentations in specialized bookstores in Munich and Vienna. Her approach to social survival was based on exploiting the nostalgia of conservative sectors of Germany who remembered the regime as a period of order and national greatness, regardless of its criminal aspects. Emmy offered these audiences access to the glamorous memory of the Reich without confronting them with disturbing realities about genocide and military aggression. She was a skilled seller of a sugar-coated version of the past. Conservative cultural circles in Munich gradually accepted her as a curious historical relic rather than an active political threat. Her status as a professional actress gave her artistic credibility that transcended political associations, and her advanced age made her an object of sympathy rather than condemnation. This partial rehabilitation demonstrated how the passage of time could erode moral responsibilities if public perception was skillfully managed. Art was the main bridge that enabled this partial reintegration. Emmy participated in private recitals, poetry readings, and commemorative events for former theaters destroyed by Allied bombing. She was never announced as a guest of honor, but her presence was carefully leaked to the press. These events helped reconstruct an image of an artist who was a victim of historical fate, rather than a privileged collaborator of the regime. Her relationship with her daughter Edda became a central element of her image management. Emmy presented herself as a devoted mother whose personal sacrifice had protected her daughter from the consequences of her breakdown. Photographs from the 1950s and 1960s, showing them together, projected feminine vulnerability, contrasting with the imperial images from her time as First Lady. This visual transformation was calculated to evoke sympathy without requiring compromising verbal explanations. Her income came from multiple, carefully diversified sources: occasional sales of personal belongings salvaged from confiscated estates, fees for interviews and articles, and discreet donations from nostalgic fans. Emmy had learned to monetize her historical notoriety without compromising her apparent dignity. She was a skilled entrepreneur of her own fading celebrity. Among the objects sold were discreet jewelry, costume sketches, autographed portraits, and theatrical manuscripts. These sales were not conducted publicly, but rather through intermediaries and private auctions in Switzerland and Austria. Emmy carefully controlled what was sold and what was to remain as a family legacy. This control over her own personal archive was part of her strategy to define her version of history. Recent years brought a gradual reconciliation with sectors of official German culture. Although it never fully regained its former theatrical status, it was increasingly accepted as a historical survivor whose testimony had documentary value independent of controversies over personal responsibility. Its longevity had made it a living relic, fascinating for its proximity to absolute power rather than for its specific political views. Theatre critics, especially the more conservative, began to refer to Emmy as a symbol of a lost artistic era. Without celebrating her ideology, they recognized her acting talent and classical training. This aesthetic recovery allowed her to maintain an indirect public voice, where she spoke of culture, beauty, and tradition without needing to justify the political past of her milieu. Emmy's funeral in 1973 attracted a surprisingly large crowd, including veterans of German theatre, cultural journalists, and historical observers. The obituaries treated her primarily as an actress who had lived through extraordinary times, downplaying her political role in favor of her artistic identity. This posthumous rehabilitation completed the process of transformation she had undergone. Ilse Hess, Keeper of the Forbidden Flame. Between 1941 and 1987, Ilse Hess wrote 10,426 letters to her husband, who was imprisoned in Spandau prison. This correspondence, meticulously preserved and later published in several volumes, became the most important documentary foundation of post-war revisionism. More than a simple exchange between estranged spouses, it was a literary collaboration dedicated to constructing and maintaining a myth. Rudolf Hess as a martyr of peace and a victim of historical misunderstanding. The peculiarity of Rudolf's flight to Scotland in 1941 created an unprecedented situation in the movement's history. Unlike other leaders who died in combat or were executed, Hess remained alive but imprisoned for decades. This exceptional longevity transformed Ilse into the widow of a man who was still breathing, creating a unique emotional and political dynamic that she masterfully exploited for an unprecedented rehabilitation campaign. Each of Ilse's letters followed a carefully designed structure, seemingly innocent family news in the first paragraph, followed by historical reflections reinterpreting events of the Third Reich, and concluding with declarations of loyalty that kept the flame of National Socialism alive. This formula allowed her to communicate political content under the guise of personal correspondence, evading prison censorship while conveying messages to wider audiences. Over the years, Ilse perfected the indirect language necessary to evade controls. She used literary allusions, private codes, and biblical references as vehicles to camouflage ideological messages. This sophisticated communication strategy turned her letters into tools of symbolic resistance within the rigid prison regime. Her detailed and consistent writing, maintained even under adverse health conditions, reflected a mission assumed beyond conjugal affection. The guest house she established in the Allgäu served as an unofficial center for nostalgia pilgrimage. SS veterans, extremist sympathizers, and those curious about revisionism found in Ilse direct access to someone who had been in Hitler's inner circle. Her conversations with guests transformed into informal indoctrination sessions where she delivered watered-down versions of history, presenting the government apparatus as an idealistic movement corrupted by adverse circumstances. The place also served as a distribution point for printed materials. From there, Ilse coordinated the dispatch of newsletters, copies of old speeches, and excerpts of selected letters for reprinting in sympathetic magazines. She utilized editorial contacts built during the regime to secure printing and distribution in Germany, Austria, and South America. All this occurred while maintaining a legal facade as a simple rural boarding house. Her collaboration with Stille Hilfe manifested practical dimensions of her post-war activism. This organization, dedicated to assisting war criminals, found Ilse to be an exceptionally effective fundraiser. Her status as the widow of a Reich leader and her talent for evoking sympathy made her an ideal figure for soliciting donations. For decades, she channeled significant resources toward legal defenses for accused criminals and the families of imprisoned criminals. The books she published between 1952 and 1987 constituted a literary corpus devoted entirely to her husband's rehabilitation. Presented as family memoirs and historical documentation, they effectively functioned as disguised propaganda. Her ability to maintain a personal and intimate tone while promoting extremist interpretations made them persuasive to readers who would have rejected more explicit propaganda. Some of these titles were distributed semi-secretly at historical book fairs, and others circulated by mail among sympathizers. Ilse carefully curated the design of each publication. She selected sober covers, conciliatory prefaces, and biographical notes that omitted all references to crimes. Her editorial skill served to legitimize narratives carefully constructed over decades. The international campaign to free Rudolf demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Cold War geopolitics. Ilse argued that keeping an elderly man imprisoned for crimes from half a century earlier was incompatible with the humanitarian values that the West proclaimed against Soviet communism. This tactic generated sympathy in circles that would have been hostile to more explicit revisionism, presenting the release as proof of democratic magnanimity. The vigils held outside Spandau during the 1970s and 1980s became media events that attracted international attention. Her image as a devout elderly woman waiting outside the prison walls generated poignant photographs used by conservative media outlets to question the justice of Hess's continued imprisonment. These demonstrations functioned as political theater that transformed Ilse into a symbol of marital fidelity, transcending political considerations. As Hess grew older, Ilse intensified her campaign through speeches at historic conferences, public statements, and lobbying local parties. She also maintained contact with European government officials, to whom she sent formal appeals for humanitarian clemency. Her ability to operate within diplomatic and media channels gave her unusual credibility among like-minded groups. Her insistence that Rudolf had been assassinated in 1987 to avoid embarrassing revelations created a conspiracy theory that persists in extremist circles. This alternative version of his death transformed Hess into a double martyr, for his supposed peace mission and for his alleged murder. Ilse had managed to transform every aspect of her husband's biography into an element of political mythology useful for contemporary propaganda. Her final years were marked by intense activity as a speaker at revisionist conferences and correspondence with researchers seeking primary sources on the Reich. Her longevity had transformed her into one of the last direct survivors of the Reich, granting her testimonial authority that she systematically used to promote favorable interpretations of the system to audiences who valued access to first-hand witnesses. Even from her final residence, Ilse continued to correspond with publishers, archives, and foundations collecting documents from the National Socialist era. She indirectly participated in the creation of private libraries dedicated to the Reich, overseeing selections of materials to be preserved and those to be hidden. This role made her a key player in the effort to preserve an alternative narrative to the dominant discourse. Ilse's death in 1995 closed the last direct channel between the original leadership and contemporary extremist movements. For more than half a century, she had functioned as the guardian of an alternative memory that downplayed the criminal aspects of the apparatus while emphasizing presentable elements as noble. Her success in keeping this narrative alive demonstrated the power of personal persistence in shaping historical memory. Hedwig Höss, the Lady of Auschwitz. The Höss family villa at Auschwitz had strategically placed windows to offer panoramic views of the extermination camp. From the master bedroom, the crematorium chimneys, watchtowers, and the electrified barbed wire fences that enclosed hundreds of thousands of prisoners could be clearly seen. This visual proximity was no coincidence. Rudolf Höss had deliberately designed the residence to oversee genocidal operations from his family home. Hedwig therefore woke up each morning staring directly into the industrial machinery of death. Domestic routine in the village coexisted with chilling normality alongside the greatest crime in human history. Hedwig organized birthday parties for her 5 children, while gas chambers operated meters away. She supervised piano lessons and horseback riding classes while trainloads of victims arrived daily. She received visits from the wives of other SS officers for tea in gardens that smelled persistently of burning human flesh. Enslaved domestic staff provided Hedwig with direct participation in the camp's exploitative structures. Female prisoners cleaned the house, cared for the children, and maintained the gardens under armed supervision. Hedwig treated them as useful objects whose humanity was irrelevant to domestic purposes. Survivor accounts describe her casual cruelty, punishments for imagined infractions, quotidian humiliations, and utter indifference to the suffering she witnessed daily. Looted goods from victims regularly arrived at the village as household supplies. Hedwig personally selected jewelry, clothing, shoes, and other valuables from among belongings confiscated from deportees. Her wardrobe included dresses designed with expropriated fabrics, her children played with toys stolen from murdered families, and her kitchen was run with utensils looted from destroyed homes. Family life was sustained entirely by the spoils of genocide. The management of daily life in the village did not occur outside the concentration camp system, but rather as a domestic extension of it. Hedwig was the primary administrator of a household fully supplied by the apparatus of plunder and deportation. From the choice of food to the distribution of tasks among the prisoners assigned as servants, every domestic decision implied a structural validation of the camp as a primary source of resources. Access to these goods was neither haphazard nor disorganized. Personal belongings confiscated in the so-called Canada, the storage and classification sector for stolen objects, were distributed hierarchically. Classified boxes arrived weekly at the commanders' homes containing items separated by utility and value. Tableware, watches, fine textiles, complete toys, and even canned goods of Czech or French origin were delivered under the label reusable civilian material. Olfactory adaptation to the constant scent of human incineration represents an extreme form of psychological habituation. Prisoners who worked at the village recall Hedwig complaining of these odors as a domestic nuisance comparable to industrial fumes or plumbing problems. This sensory normalization demonstrates the human capacity to adapt perception to circumstances that should be unbearable, allowing for daily coexistence with direct evidence of horror. In addition to preferential access to stolen goods, Hedwig enjoyed formal benefits granted by the regime to the wives of high-ranking officers. These included ration books with special supplements, military transportation for regional travel, and administrative documentation certifying her family status with the party. These benefits reinforced her position within a deeply hierarchical social structure in which even the domestic sphere operated under the logic of power. Household management also included coordination with other internal camp bodies to ensure a continuous supply of fresh food, clothing for the children, minor repairs, and security. The village kitchen, regularly supplied with confiscated agricultural products, benefited from internal distribution networks controlled by the SS, which prioritized the commanders' families over any civilian needs. Family photographs from the Auschwitz period depict scenes of bourgeois domestic bliss that contrast starkly with the genocidal context. Children playing in flowery gardens, family picnics, Christmas celebrations, bicycle rides. This visual documentation, preserved in family archives, provides disturbing evidence of the compartmentalization of moral experience under extreme conditions. Hedwig's decision to remain in the village when Rudolf fled in 1945 reflected a calculated understanding of her survival prospects. As a woman seemingly devoted only to domestic roles, she expected the Allies to consider her less responsible than her fugitive husband. This assessment demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the gender expectations that would influence treatment by the post-war judicial system. Hedwig's departure from the Auschwitz area did not immediately imply a collapse of her protective network. In the days following Rudolf's escape, Hedwig reorganized her surroundings to conceal any direct evidence of her role as the commandant's wife. She destroyed compromising documents, hid photographs, and altered her appearance to blend in among the millions of displaced Germans. She needed no outside help for this. The Nazi bureaucratic apparatus, even in collapse, had left sufficient means for minor figures to escape the radar of the Allied authorities. The British interrogations revealed a personality that had developed sophisticated mechanisms to avoid confronting the moral implications of his situation. His evasive responses reflected not genuine ignorance but a deliberate denial tactic honed over years of living with horror. His ability to maintain a pose of domestic innocence even under intense pressure demonstrated compartmentalization skills that transcended basic psychological survival. Emigrating to the United States under a false identity completed the transformation that took her from the wife of the Auschwitz commandant to an anonymous immigrant in the German-American community. Her ability to completely reinvent herself and live for decades without detection highlighted the limitations of criminal tracking systems and the possibility for Holocaust perpetrators to live peacefully in countries that had fought against the regime. Her death in 1989 beneath an anonymous gravestone marked only Mutti symbolized the successful culmination of a method based on invisibility and denial. Hedwig had managed to escape the consequences of having lived at the epicenter of the greatest crime in history, demonstrating that domestic complicity in genocide could go unpunished if it was practiced within traditionally feminine roles and silence was maintained for sufficiently long. The preservation of the villa as part of the Auschwitz Memorial provides a tangible, physical reminder of the coexistence between horror and domesticity. Visitors can walk through rooms where the Hoss family developed normal routines while industrial genocide operated next door. This architectural proximity challenges conventional notions about the moral distance necessary to ignore mass suffering and demonstrates that complicity can take seemingly banal but deeply corrupting forms.